desperate farmer challenged Trump to prove he cared, never expecting him to show up. But when the president's convoy rolled in, everything changed. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was a fight for survival. And one letter was about to shake the nation. Donald Trump had always been known for his boldness, but today was different. Sitting at his desk in Mar-a-Lago, he turned over a handwritten letter, unpolished, rough around the edges, but striking in its honesty. Mr. President, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to care. But if you do, I dare you to come see what life is really like for farmers like me. Trump smirked, intrigued by the challenge rather than the plea for help. Most letters were either full of admiration or criticism, but this one felt different. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't rehearsed. And most importantly, it wasn't begging. The politicians talk. The corporations thrive, and men like me, we drown. Trump tapped the letter against his desk, his mind already made up before his advisors even had the chance to intervene. Give me a plane to Nebraska, he said, tossing the letter aside as his eyes exchanged uneasy glances. They had been here before, trying to steer him away from unpredictable situations, but they knew better than to argue. Once Trump set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. This wasn't just a visit, it was a test. The presidential convoy rumbled down a dusty road, a stark contrast to the polished streets of Washington. Black SUVs rolled through Carter family farms, sending small clouds of dirt into the air. Secret Service agents scanned the area cautiously, their trained eyes studying surroundings for any threats. But there were no flashing cameras, no orchestrated banners, just an old farm, battered by time and struggle. Samuel Carter stood tall near his barn, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Broad-shouldered and hardened by years of backbreaking labor, he wasn't the type to be easily impressed. As Trump stepped out, Samuel wiped his hands on his overalls and extended a firm handshake. Mr. President, I appreciate you coming, but I won't sugarcoat my words. Trump smirked, gripping his hand. I wouldn't expect anything less. Without hesitation, Samuel jumped straight to the point. Sir, politicians make big promises, but farmers are drowning. Prices drop, fuel costs rise. Are you here to listen or just to talk? Trump raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the bluntness. I respect farmers, but things take time. Samuel scoffed, shaking his head in frustration. We don't have time. Our land suffers, families break under debt, and corporations buy out small farms faster than we can fight back. Inside their modest kitchen, Samuel pointed at the fridge with a tired look. Mr. President, we grow food for thousands, but we can barely afford our own groceries. Trump frowned, a rare moment of silence stretching between them. What's stopping you from succeeding? He finally asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. Samuel leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Big corporations. They buy land, drive down prices, and push out small farmers. Trump tapped the table, his expression unreadable. That's capitalism, he said, though the words sounded more like a question than a statement. Samuel clenched his jaw, not backing down. There's a difference between competition and being crushed. Grace, Samuel's wife, placed a plate of homemade cornbread in front of Trump. Mr. President, you should taste what struggling America really is, she said with a small, knowing smile. Trump took a bite, chewing thoughtfully before nodding. It's good, he admitted, but the taste wasn't the only thing lingering in his mind. Grace sighed, her expression weary. We sell this at the market, but barely make enough to cover the cost of keeping the farm running. Samuel rolled up his sleeves as they stepped outside, his hands rough and stained with years of labor. Let me show you something, he said, lifting his palms up for Trump to see. These hands have worked this soil since I was a boy. My father's hands looked the same, and his before him. Trump studied them, noticing every crack, every layer of callous skin. Hard work, he said simply, as if stating an undeniable truth. Samuel nodded, his expression unwavering. But hard work alone isn't enough anymore. Trump exhaled, glancing at the endless field stretching toward the horizon. So what do you want from me? He asked, though there was no sarcasm in his voice this time. Samuel met his gaze without flinching. Not handouts, not speeches, real change. Trump was quiet for a moment before smirking. Ever driven a tractor? Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. Not the kind you're used to. He led Trump to an old John Deere tractor. Its paint chipped, but its engine still strong. Samuel patted the side of the tractor, nodding toward the seat. Hop in. Trump hesitated for a moment before climbing up, gripping the controls as Samuel instructed him. This is what feeds America, Samuel said as Trump maneuvered the heavy machine forward, his grip tightening. The weight of it, the power, the responsibility wasn't lost on him. As they walked back toward the house, Samuel wiped sweat from his brow, his patience running thin. We aren't lazy. We aren't asking for favors, but banks treat us like risks while corporations get bailouts. Trump frowned, his thoughts clearly spinning. I believe in free markets, he said, but his voice lacked its usual sharp certainty. Samuel shook his head, his frustration evident. Markets should be fair, not rigged. Trump sighed, rubbing his chin as he took in the farm around him. The system's complicated. Samuel scoffed, shaking his head. Not to us, it's simple. If we fail, America's food supply fails. Grace stepped forward, offering a small smile despite the tension. Would you like to stay for dinner, Mr. President? Trump blinked, clearly caught off guard. Dinner, he repeated, as if the idea itself was foreign to him. Samuel chuckled, crossing his arms. We're blunt, but we're hospitable. Trump hesitated, glancing toward his staff who were already preparing to usher him away. But instead of brushing them off, he looked back at Samuel and Grace. All right, he said, surprising even himself. Grace's smile widened. Good. You'll see what real farm food tastes like. Samuel smirked, shaking his head. And hear more of my complaints. Trump laughed, shaking his head as well. I figured. As they walked inside, Samuel couldn't shake a strange feeling deep in his gut. Maybe this visit would actually make a difference. He just hoped Trump would remember their conversation long after he left the farm, and he had no idea what was coming next. The kitchen was filled with the comforting scent of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and warm cornbread. Grace moved with ease, setting plates on the wooden table while Samuel poured 2 glasses of iced tea. Trump sat down, glancing around the room, taking in the modest surroundings. There were no luxury chandeliers, no gold-plated silverware, just a home built from years of sweat and sacrifice. Samuel took his seat, eyeing Trump as he picked up his fork. No fancy White House meals, he said with a smirk. Trump chewed slowly, nodding. Good food. Grace offered a small, knowing smile. Good food made by hard-working hands. Samuel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You've heard our struggles, Mr. President, but what happens when you leave? Trump set his fork down, wiping his mouth with a napkin. I don't forget conversations like this. Samuel studied him for a long moment. We'll see. Something about this dinner felt different from the countless meetings Trump had attended. The words spoken here weren't rehearsed talking points, they were real. The frustration in Samuel's voice, the exhaustion in Grace's eyes, the weight of an uncertain future hanging over them like a storm cloud. It wasn't politics. It was survival, and that struck a nerve. Samuel tapped the table with his fingers, his voice steady but firm. Farmers are forced to sell their land to corporations because they control prices and we can't compete. Trump leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. So what's the solution? Samuel sighed, shaking his head. Stronger protections for small farmers. Better trade policies that don't leave us in the doubt. Trump exhaled, considering his words carefully. I've been tough on trade. Samuel didn't hesitate. But we still suffer. Grace, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke up. Farming isn't just numbers, Mr. President. It's people, families, generations. Trump looked around the room, his gaze lingering on a framed photo of Samuel's father standing in the same kitchen, decades earlier. For the first time, he saw the human side of policy. He wasn't reading statistics from a report, he was looking at the reality of the choices made in Washington. And reality had a way of cutting through all the noise. As the meal came to an end, Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. So, Mr. President, what now? Trump exhaled, pushing his plate aside. I don't make empty promises. Samuel smirked. Good, because we don't trust empty words. Trump stood, extending his hand. Give me time. Samuel folded his arms. We don't have time. For a moment, neither man spoke, but there was an understanding between them. This wasn't just another handshake. Samuel finally took his hand. Then prove it. Trump held his grip for a moment longer before nodding. I will. As he stepped outside, he took one last look at the land stretching endlessly before him. This wasn't just a political issue anymore, it was personal. Samuel watched as the convoy disappeared down the road, shaking his head. He won't remember, he muttered. Grace placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. Maybe this time he will. 2 weeks later, Samuel was out by the fence line, hammering in a new post when his phone rang. He wiped the sweat from his brow and answered without checking the caller ID. This is Samuel. A familiar voice responded, sending a jolt through his chest. Samuel, it's Donald Trump. For a moment, he thought it was a joke. His grip tightened around the phone. Mr. President? Trump's voice was steady. I didn't forget you. I've got something in motion. Samuel's heart pounded as he leaned against the fence post. What do you mean? Trump paused, as if debating how much to reveal. You'll see soon enough. The line went dead, leaving Samuel staring at his phone in disbelief. Grace stepped outside, noticing the look on his face. Who was that? Samuel smirked, still trying to process what had just happened. The President of the United States. For the first time in years, he felt something unexpected hope. A month later, Samuel sat in his truck, the radio playing softly as he finished his morning coffee. The voice of the news anchor crackled through the speakers. We have breaking news. President Trump has signed an executive order aimed at protecting small farmers from unfair corporate practices. Samuel's jaw dropped, his breath catching in his throat. Grace rushed outside, her eyes wide with anticipation. Did you hear? Samuel pushed open the truck door, still in shock. He actually did something. Across the country, small farmers watched in disbelief. A president had listened, and more importantly, he had acted. Samuel wasn't a man who was easily impressed, but this was real. He had spent years watching politicians make promises they never kept. And yet, here was a moment that felt different. One afternoon, as Samuel tended to the fields, a black SUV rolled up the dirt road. A Secret Service agent stepped out, scanning the property. Mr. Carter, the president wants to see you. Samuel blinked in surprise. Again. Minutes later, Donald Trump stepped out of the vehicle, extending a hand. Told you I wouldn't forget. Samuel shook his head, grinning despite himself. I'll admit I'm impressed. Trump smirked. I don't just talk, I deliver. Grace stepped out onto the porch, hands on her hips. Well, if you came all this way, you might as well come inside. As they sat down at the kitchen table once again, Trump leaned forward. I want to hear more. There's still work to do. Samuel was speechless. A president had returned, not for a photo op, but to listen. And that meant everything. Trump walked the fields with Samuel, taking in the sights and sounds of the land. What else do farmers need? He asked. Samuel didn't hesitate. Infrastructure, roads, irrigation, better equipment access. Trump nodded. All right, let's make it happen. Samuel squinted at him, skeptical. You serious? Trump smirked. You should know by now I don't joke about winning. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. Well, I hope farmers finally start winning. Trump patted his shoulder. They will. For the first time in years, Samuel saw a future where farming wasn't a losing battle. Maybe, just maybe, the tides were turning. And it had all started with a simple letter. News outlets swarmed the farm, eager to understand why the president had returned. Why did the president come back? A reporter asked. Samuel shrugged. Because he actually cares. Critics called it a publicity stunt, but Samuel disagreed. He listened when no one else did. Trump faced the cameras, his expression serious. Farmers are the backbone of America. I won't let them fall. For once, the political divide faded. Farmers, workers, families, they all saw something rare. A leader who wasn't just talking, he was acting. And Samuel, once skeptical, now found himself at the center of something bigger than he had ever imagined. As calls poured in from farmers nationwide, one message stood out. Samuel, you actually got him to listen. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. I just spoke the truth. And the fight wasn't over yet. Months later, Samuel sat at his table reviewing new farming policies with a critical eye. He frowned. We still need long-term solutions. His phone rang again. Trump's voice came through the line. Samuel, I want you on an advisory board. Samuel hesitated. Me? Trump chuckled. Who better to represent real farmers? As he walked into the White House for the first time, Samuel knew this wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about all farmers. And all of it had started with one letter that Donald Trump chose to read. One letter, one voice, one moment of courage. That's all it took to spark real change. Samuel Carter didn't have power, wealth, or connections. He had a farm, a family, and the truth. He could have stayed silent, accepting defeat like so many others. But instead, he took a risk, spoke up, and dared to challenge the most powerful man in the country. And against all odds, he was heard. This story isn't just about farmers, it's about all of us. It's about what happens when we stop waiting for someone else to fix things and start demanding action. Too often we think our struggles are invisible, that no one cares, that our voices don't matter. But they do. The world doesn't change because of silence, it changes because of those who refuse to back down. So ask yourself, what are you fighting for? Your family? Your dreams? Your future? Whatever it is, don't wait for permission to be heard. Stand up, speak out, push forward. Because sometimes All it takes is one voice, one letter, one moment of courage to change everything.